Hey everyone, it's Ryan Zomarodi here, and I'm just creating this video to tell a little bit of a story about one of the leases that I recently put together on one of my rental properties. This is also a continuation of a post I made here on LinkedIn where I'm sharing my screen, where I began the story, and this is a continuation of that where I actually am going to share the solution to this very interesting and kind of fun scenario that I was in. And I say fun because it actually ended up working out. So a little bit of a spoiler alert. But ultimately, what happened is that I've been marketing one of my largest properties in terms of size and bedroom count. It's right next to a local university, and it's pretty much been student housing. We did have a non-student tenant for a few years, but it's a prime student type of rental. And so it's a 10 bed, 7 bath home over 4,000 square feet. So very large home. And while it's a very great asset and, we can certainly lease it pretty regularly, it's just, it takes a certain kind of group to get that many people together. And when you have that many people together, you're talking 10 residents at a minimum, sometimes even more than that. And then you also have 10 co-signers because most of our residents who are students don't have the kind of income to qualify for this type of asset, right? We ask people to qualify on income and credit and things that typically students don't really have the history of, so they're not going to qualify on their own. So in order to do that, we now have 20 people on a lease that you have to run rental applications for. You have to screen them, vet everybody, and then ultimately get them to sign the lease, review, approve, sign the lease, and then collect the deposit. So it's quite a bit of a process. And I like to relate it to leasing out an entire apartment building all at once. If you had a 10-unit apartment building where each unit is renting for, 1,200, 1,300 per month, it's basically the same thing, right? It's just all on one lease. So I say that because I was very far into the process with a group. This was my second showing on the property. So I had the property on the market for a couple of months, and I had two showings. And this was actually the first showing. It just took them a couple of months to finally come around and get their group finalized so that they could actually move forward with the applications and whatnot. So I have this group go through the whole process, ended up being very qualified, spend a few weeks like really vetting them, checking all their information. And so, long story short, we approved them after probably about 40 days of getting all the documents. And I was actually on vacation for part of this, so that's why it took a little bit longer. But then we ultimately approved them, had the lease out for signature. And this is a house that rents for just under $13,000 per month. So over $150,000 in annual revenue from this house. And so as the lease is out for approval, as I'm asking for the deposit, I'm giving them a deadline to really move this thing forward. The main student, the main resident on the lease who I've been communicating with just reviews the lease, and I do have a house rules addendum that I like to put into my college rental properties. And on that addendum, it states that there's no skateboarding allowed on the premises, no bicycles on the premises. And it's really meant for the interior of the home. But, in general, we don't allow certain activities like skateboarding, because it can cause property damage, injuries, etc. And so he tells me that, hey, look, we're on the skateboarding team, in our local community, and your lease says no skateboarding. This is going to be an issue for us. And so this kind of pauses the signing, pauses the whole process. And ultimately, he continues to say this is one of the main reasons they wanted the house in the first place, that they can practice, they can host events, they could do, at least once a week, some kind of organized skating practice. And so like this was all news to me. He had also mentioned that they had said this before, but it was totally brand new to me. So, the conversation continues, and I'm like, well, what kind of skateboarding are we talking about? What exactly are you asking permission for? And so he continues saying they would like to build ramps and elevated platforms, a half pipe. and really just build a mini skate park in this driveway, right? And so one of the great things about this property is that it's a large house, but there's also a very large driveway, which is coveted in this area where you need street permits and it's very hard to find street parking. So with this driveway, they wanted to turn it, about half of it into this small skate park. And so, look, I like skateboarding. I've skated for many years. Definitely in college, I was skating every single day to get to class. So I get it. I think that would be really awesome to have that at a house that I was renting, especially when I was in college. And so I saw both sides of it. I wanted to say yes, because I think it's cool. It's going to create loyalty. It's going to create some stickiness with this group, and they may even stay another year, right? They might even keep it within their organization for many years. I'm not sure. That's never guaranteed, but I could see it being a unique amenity that attracts this type of tenant, that creates some notoriety in the community and is overall a net positive, right? Is where my mind would like to go to. But then on my, putting on the landlord hat and not the, cool college landlord hat, like really just more of the, asset manager hat, digging into it, it can create, liability exposure. There's property damage risk, right? If they're skating and scratching up the driveway, boards flying into the garage, into the glass, like who knows, that sort of stuff. I mean, but obviously the biggest risk is if somebody, breaks their neck, if somebody dies on this half pipe on my property and I allowed this to happen, right? If I allowed this type of behavior, that would have been catastrophic, right? Especially if they're bringing in people from other houses or who are not on the lease. If they're hosting events here and having other people skating on this property, that's potentially a liability nightmare, right? If somebody, falls skateboarding and they literally hit their head on the concrete because of some, fault in the construction, or just that's just what happens when you're skateboarding, right? It's one of the, the sports that is very prone to injury. So with all that being said, it's like there's that. There's also, neighbors immediately adjacent to this property that could complain if there's noise, if there's music, if there's just constant ollieing and popping up. There could be city violations, right? I'm looking up, do you need a permit to build a half pipe on your property? What are the restrictions? Is this even legal to do from a building permit standpoint? And I, my conclusion was that yes, it is legal technically. If under a certain height, I think it was 6 feet. If it's under 6 feet, you don't need a permit to build this type of structure. But even then, there could be noise violations, city violations, who knows what, right? And so if I say yes, I'm exposing myself to all of these things, right? Also the insurance policy, it's already expensive, right? Everybody in real estate knows insurance prices and premiums have gone up substantially over the past several years. And with this in play, who knows? They could either revoke the policy entirely, or I'd have to get a new policy that would, increase our holding costs. So a lot of unknowns. And if I said yes, it's just kind of opening up a can of worms. But if I say no and say, hey, none of this is allowed, then I could potentially lose this group and they could walk away. And, of course, I'm, optimistic that I can lease this place again, but it's just restarting, months of due diligence and months of the leasing process, which I value my time and, the time I've already invested here. I have a good group on the line who are ready to move forward. And so really just all of that revenue being on the line, I had to come to a solution, right? And so what did I exactly do? The thing that I decided on was, we couldn't specifically allow this to happen on the property, right? There's a big difference between allowing it to happen and not allowing it. And so what I ultimately did was create an addendum that specifically addresses this, and not allowing it, but addressing the general use of the driveway for recreational activities that could happen on the driveway. So I'll share with you just the actual lease addendum, which I believe protects me as the property owner, it protects management, but it also keeps the liability on the tenant, and it keeps the control based on the tenant's activity. So ultimately, what this is a driveway use and recreational structures addendum, recreational structures restriction addendum. So it's part of the lease, but it basically says, hey, you cannot build any recreational structures or elevated features. So one of the things I told them was like, after consideration, we are not going to allow any half pipes, any rails, boxes, jumps, no platforms, nothing that's built upon the property at all, like without any approval, right? You cannot do that. There's no, attachments to the property. You can't bolt on anything to the cement or the walls or fencing. And so that might seem restrictive, but so what we did was it's called a limited non-enforcement carve out for flat ground skating only, right? So this is where it gets very nuanced, and this is where the protection really is. This is where the magic is that it basically like says that we're not going to enforce this rule in the lease, right? What it says is that we're not necessarily allowing this activity. We're not allowing skateboarding, but we're just giving them a limited non-enforcement carve out, meaning we're not going to enforce the lease for casual flat ground recreational use of the driveway by the tenants only. So it would only apply to tenants on the lease. So again, it's in plain English here and it makes sense. So the housing provider agrees it won't treat casual flat ground recreational use of the driveway by named tenants as a lease default solely on that basis, provided that the addendum is followed. So there's strict rules that they must follow, which are outlined in this addendum. But if they follow those rules, then we won't enforce that part of the lease. So it's still part of the lease, right? No skateboarding is still in the lease, and they've agreed to it happily. But again, what this addendum says is that it says we're not going to enforce that part of the lease if you follow these guidelines and rules, right? And it's also limited, it's conditional, and it's a revocable carve out, right? So we can revoke this at any time. Obviously that's not our intention. Like, we want them to have fun. We want them to enjoy the property. I want them to skate, and I want them to pay the rent, right? And I don't want them to get in trouble or hurt themselves or cause any problems, right? So it's at their sole risk. They're responsible for damage, right? Tenant responsibility for damage. They're fully responsible for property damage, right? If the concrete is chipped, scratched, the walls are banged up, the garage door gets dented, anything beyond ordinary wear and tear, they are responsible. And I do have a, relatively large security deposit, almost $13,000, which can cover any property damage, including this. We also didn't allow any events or organized activity or guest participation. So like I said, there's no one from another house. There's no one that is in their organization who isn't named on the lease that's allowed to do these things, right? So no guests are allowed, no organized practices, events. You cannot promote or advertise this recreational skate location at all. And then the recreational use is not a property amenity or lease feature, meaning that this isn't included in the lease, right? You're not paying for the right to use this driveway to skateboard. So again, these are all just like carve outs that, the reason why this is here is because if something happens on the property and then somebody sues somebody, right? They might sue the tenants, and most certainly they would sue the landlord, and they would sue the management, right? Which is me, management and landlord. So if there's anything that happens in a lawsuit, right, they're going to go after the people with the money. They're going to go after the homeowners, and they're going to look at the lease and they're going to say, if you allowed this, then you're at fault, right? So we're basically saying, like, this isn't part of what you're paying for. This isn't part of the lease. And if we revoke this right from you as the tenants, then you're still getting exactly what we agreed you're getting in exchange for the rent. So again, all of this language is very relevant and matters. Also, a clause about noise, nuisance, and law compliance. So again, if there's any complaints, any city violations, any legal issues with it, then we can revoke access to it. We're also requiring renters insurance of at least $300,000 per person, and they must provide proof of coverage. And then they're also going to put us as me as additionally insured, my company, and then obviously indemnifying the owner, as well as, property management, just completely indemnifying us from anything that happens, any injuries, damages, losses, liabilities. And then, like I already said, it's a revocable license to use the driveway as such. And then, of course, no indoor writing. So again, just a very nuanced situation where, I had to balance the interests of the tenants, who are, a great group of kids. I have no reason to believe that they mean any harm. Like, they're going about their college studies, and they have a great hobby, which, I think skateboarding is fantastic. And so, like, I wanted to make it work with them, but at the same time, them creating this obstacle to signing the lease and moving forward was something that I really had to spend time on and create this structure that I didn't start out knowing that this was the route I was going to go through. I've never had this situation come up at all. And I think that's part of part of property management and leasing and owning property that a lot of people don't really see, because they might not be in that seat. They delegate management, or they're, kind of a passive investor on deals. But these are the decisions that can really protect your investment or cause serious legal issues down the road, or potentially lose revenue, right? So I just wanted to share this. I know it's probably not a lot of people who are going to really be interested in this kind of stuff, but for those of you who are kind of nerding out on the nuances of, contracts and landlord-tenant relationships, I really appreciate you guys, and hopefully you found some value in this. And if you're ever kind of in a similar situation, hopefully this is something that you can use in the future, where you can have specific, non-enforcement carve-outs for various things in your lease, while at the same time not allowing those activities, right? There's that legal difference, which could, hopefully I'll never have to be in court for this. That's the goal. But if I were, served to go to court, then I feel very protected with this language in the lease. So I'll leave it at that. Again, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any additional questions, or if you have any other topics that you'd like me to cover. Really appreciate you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.